Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Sunday, 7 April 2024. A comment on my video on Ernst Jünger drew my attention to a striking passage from Friedrich Engels, which appears to show a rare degree of insight into the war that was to come, which was, for Engels in his time, the First World War. So here's the quote. Quote, Germany will have allies, but it will leave them in the lurch, and then Germany at the first opportunity. And finally, the only war left for Prussia Germany to wage will be a world war, moreover, of an extent and violence hitherto unimagined. 8 to 10 million soldiers will be at each other's throats, and in the process they will strip Europe barer than a swarm of locusts. The depredations of the 30 Years' War compressed into 3 or 4 years and extended over the entire continent. Famine, disease, the universal lapse into barbarism, both of the armies and the people in the wake of acute misery, irretrievable dislocation of our artificial system of trade, industry, and credit, ending in universal bankruptcy, collapse of the old states and their conventional political wisdom to the point where crowns will roll into the gutters by the dozen and no one will be around to pick them up. The absolute impossibility of foreseeing how it will all end and who will emerge as the victor from the battle. Only one consequence is absolutely certain: universal exhaustion and the creation of the conditions for the ultimate victory of the working class, unquote. This quote was new to me, but I subsequently found it in several sources. So it's been quoted in several places. And you can find it in volume 26 of the collected works of Marx and Engels. It is from an introduction that Engels wrote to a pamphlet by Sigismund Borkheim titled In Memory of the German Blood and Thunder Patriots 1806-1807, originally published in 1887. And it's also been translated as In the Memory of the German Patriots of Murder 1806-1807. The German title is Deutschen Mordspatrioten. So I'm not sure how best that should be rendered. In any case, Borkheim was writing about events 80 years in the past. This was a period of the Napoleonic Wars known as the War of the Fourth Coalition. And there was a War of the Third Coalition before this and a War of the Fifth Coalition after this, because the period of Napoleonic warfare was one that was nearly continuous until Napoleon's defeat. Interestingly, the War of the Fourth Coalition included the Battle of Jena-Auerstadt, and the illustration I have been using as a background for my episodes is a contemporaneous painting of the Battle of Jena-Auerstadt. It was here that Hegel was a young professor, and he was just finishing up his first big book, The Phenomenology of Spirit, when the battle broke out. And so Hegel gathered up his manuscript and got the hell out of Dodge. But as he was leaving Jena, he saw Napoleon, which he famously called the world spirit on horseback. So that's why I've been using this picture of Jena. And this was one of the bigger battles of the War of the Fourth Coalition. So why was Borkheim writing a pamphlet about a war in 1807 in 1887, 80 years later? A book you might expect to follow 80 years later, but a pamphlet is intended to be timely. So to understand that, we need a little bit of backstory. Borkheim was a perpetual revolutionary and a sometime wine salesman, in his later life at least, and a friend of both Marx and Engels. Borkheim was an active participant in the Springtime of Nations, which is what we've come to call 1848 in Europe, where there were so many revolutions that it seemed like the whole continent was changing rather rapidly. And there was a lot of crazy stuff that went down in 1848. And Borkheim, who was at the time serving in the military, joined revolutionary military units, participated in several campaigns, and eventually served time in a number of prisons for his actions. So during the Napoleonic Wars, the revolutionary French forces repeatedly defeated, and you could even say humiliated, any number of armies that it engaged. And then a generation later, during the Springtime of Nations in 1848, it looked like the revolutionary fervor had been wound up to an even higher pitch than the French Revolution. And many people thought that it was going to spell the end of reactionary regimes all across Europe. But in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-1871, the Prussians won, and no one viewed the Prussians as representatives of revolutionary zeal. Quite the opposite. They're usually used as a poster child for a reactionary 19th century regime. So just to be a wet blanket, Borkheim was reaching back 80 years to remind the Germans of a defeat, so they wouldn't get too cocky over their victory in the Franco-Prussian War. Like Marx and Engels, Borkheim still believed that the inevitable revolution was coming. To me, the pamphlet sounds like pure cope on Borkheim's part, and Engels played along with the cope by writing an introduction to it, implying that he needed to cope too. Engels' introduction to Borkheim indicated that Engels was not only interested in the past of the War of the Fourth Coalition, or the past of the Springtime of Nations, but he was also interested in the future. The quoted paragraph sounds like as good a prediction of World War I as we could find. And as an apparent prediction of something most did not predict, it's worthwhile looking into it. We need to listen to the rare voices that turned out to be right, even though we shouldn't listen uncritically. What we want to know is whether they were right for the right reasons or they were right for the wrong reasons. In a world of billions of persons, it is statistically almost inevitable that there's going to be someone out there somewhere making an accurate prediction. But if that prediction is just a mere accident, then it's no more interest to us than any of the other white noise that comes and goes. But of course, when thoughtful individuals like Engels or Borkheim, for that matter, take the trouble to write out their predictions and then to give reasons for them, they are rarely entirely right or entirely wrong, because they've made some attempt at explanation, and that attempt at explanation has to have some correspondence to actual events. So usually what we find is a mixture of prescience and blindness, which is why most predictions are half right and why most long-range predictions are mostly wrong, because the other half of the right predictions, the half that wasn't predicted, eventually the incorrect portions accumulate and push events in an unprecedented direction. You can find something like a similar prediction to Engels in H.G. Wells' The Shape of Things to Come, which was made into the film Things to Come, which imagines a First World War that doesn't end, and with England broken up into regions ruled by warlords until a new international force, which is, of course, enlightened and humanitarian, descends upon the warlords and displaces them. For Engels, the enlightened ones are the class-conscious proletarians who eventually triumph by expropriating the expropriators and institute the dictatorship of the proletariat. For H.G. Wells, the enlightened ones are the engineers of the air dictatorship. In the film version, they're called Wings Over the World, who are the natural technocratic leaders of industrialization. But for today, I'm not going to say anything more about H.G. Wells. I just wanted to mention that as another prescient voice, as it were. And instead, I'm going to focus on Engels. Engels wrote enough about military affairs in his time that some people actually called him the Red Clausewitz. So how right and how wrong was the Red Clausewitz in predicting the war to come? If we take the paragraph I quoted earlier and we break it down into constituent parts, I get about 10 different aspects of the prediction. There's some you can break it down into more parts or fewer parts, a greater number of parts or a fewer number of parts. But generally speaking, there's several aspects to it. So, number one, a world war. And that certainly came true. Number two, unprecedented extent and violence. Well, that's a wash. Maybe it was unprecedented. Maybe the violence was or wasn't. It's hard to say. Number three, 8 to 10 million soldiers. There he actually fell short because about 65 million soldiers were mobilized for the First World War. So it was actually an order of magnitude greater number of soldiers than Engels predicted. Number four, Europe stripped bare as if by locusts. Well, certainly parts of Europe were stripped bare, the parts where the trenches were. But one of the things that we often don't know about the First World War is that we've seen all the pictures of the Second World War and the bombings and the destroyed cities. I did an episode on the bombing of Dresden, which was destroyed in just a couple of days' time. And most of the First World War was essentially fought in the countryside. There were examples, of course, of towns that were completely wiped out, like Ypres in Belgium. But most of the towns were out of the line of fire. And in fact, they were booming from the trade from the military and the soldiers who were there on leave. And most of the trenches were dug through the countryside. So certainly areas were stripped bare, but not the whole of Europe. So number five, the whole of the 30 Years' War compressed into 3 or 4 years duration and extended over the entire continent. That's pretty darn accurate. It would be hard to improve over that because it was a devastating and violent and brutal event like the 30 Years' War, but it was compressed down into 4 years. So we can give Engels number five unquestioningly. Number six, famine, disease, and lapse into barbarism. Well, there may have been localized famines. There certainly was immediately after the war, the great influenza of 1918, 1919. A lapse into barbarism, you could argue that. I wouldn't go that far. Number seven, universal bankruptcy. Again, there were localized bankruptcies, but not over the whole of Europe. Number eight, collapse of old states. Now that certainly came true. The documentary Fall of Eagles is a good fictionalized account of the end of Austria-Hungary and the Tsarist Russia and the other regimes that utterly collapsed. And as Engels said, crowns rolled in the gutter and no one was there to pick them up. Number nine, universal exhaustion. Well, certainly France and Germany were exhausted at the end of the First World War. There was a terrible revolt in the French trenches. If the Germans had better intelligence, they could have gone right through that. And many people when France collapsed at the beginning of the Second World War, that came as a surprise to many people, but it shouldn't have. Marc Bloch, the famous Annals historian, wrote an account immediately after the French collapse called Strange Defeat. He was surprised by it, but I don't think anybody should have been surprised by the French rapid collapse at the beginning of the Second World War, because they were utterly exhausted at the end of the First World War, and they never really recovered from that. And number 10, creation of the conditions for the victory of the working class. Well, you could say it created those conditions in Russia because the Bolshevik Revolution then happened in 1917. It didn't happen all over the continent. You could say it happened later elsewhere on the continent, but once again, that's you could slice or dice that either way. I would argue, though, that perhaps more importantly than individual events is that for Engels, all of these events are organically connected to each other. They all follow from the same general cause, and that general cause is the unfolding failure of bourgeois society. So how good are Engels' predictions? A good prediction should involve three elements: what will happen, a date by which it will happen, or a range of dates, and the probability with which you think it will happen. So Engels tells us pretty clearly, not perfectly clearly, what he thinks will happen. And he is absolutely certain of it. So the probability level is very high. But he doesn't give us a date or a range of dates. It could be argued that some kind of date range is implicit in the internal context of the introduction to Durkheim written by Engels. But there's nothing sufficiently specific that Engels doesn't have plausible deniability for any of his predictions. He does say that the length of the war would be 3 or 4 years, and so that's accurate. So he does give a duration. But for the exhaustion and bankruptcy and barbarism all over Europe and preparing the way for the victory of the proletariat, he doesn't give dates for that. If you never furnish a date for your prediction, you can never be shown to be wrong, because it can always be claimed that the denouement is still coming. So Engels can always claim that the conditions of the victory of the working class have been created or are in the process of being created. But let's leave that aside as a quibble for the moment. And let's talk about the predictions that historians do routinely make. And the predictions that historians routinely make are predictions of past events, which we call retrodictions because they're in the past instead of the future. Most retrodictions made by historians more or less embody the principles I've mentioned of being specific, giving a date, and giving a range of certainty. But in the traditional language of historiography, that kind of terminology isn't employed. A hypothesis about the past might later be confirmed or disconfirmed by evidence that comes to light. And so with experimentation in empirical science, we expand our knowledge of the past through retrodiction and degree of confirmation. So in that sense, history is very much like empirical science. If we could extend this process into the future, we could have knowledge of the future analogous to knowledge of the past obtained through retrodiction, but we can't do this because there is no evidence of the future. But predictions are made nevertheless on the basis of past events, and usually on the basis of some theory of history. In my episode on philosophy of history before Augustine, I quoted Hayden White on all histories involving a philosophy of history, though this philosophy of history is usually left implicit. And the same goes for predicting the future. There's always an implicit philosophy of history involved in a prediction, I would argue. If it makes you feel better, we can call it a theory of history instead of a philosophy of history, because some people are uncomfortable with saying that they have any philosophy of anything. While predictions are made without the possibility of evidence, they can be tested when the present catches up with the predicted date of the event. Philip Tetlock, who wrote a book about prediction, which he calls forecasting, calls those who forecast according to a quantitatively defined methodology super forecasters, and some of them have quite a good record in what they do. If you predict according to a quantitative methodology and you regularly return to your predictions to assess their accuracy, you can significantly improve your forecasting ability over time. And it is to be expected that the intelligence services of all major nation states are engaged in sophisticated forecasting along these lines, probably much more sophisticated than what we find in open source intelligence, as with Tetlock's book. Nevertheless, intelligence agencies, interesting Freudian slip there, still manage to be surprised, or at least they pretend to be surprised at events that occur. We'll never know for sure. So, for the record, I dislike predictions. Too much prediction that has been related to history has been a particularly silly kind of futurism. Some years ago, under circumstances I don't recall exactly, I was corresponding with an editor of Futurist magazine, and I suggested an article on futurism without predictions. If memory serves, my correspondent was only lukewarm about the idea, so I didn't follow up on it, but I did write a blog post about it, and it's something that has been on my mind ever since. I think it's possible to extend the methods of history to the future. And I also think that we need to do this to provide a rational account of the whole of time and not only the past. In my episodes on Herman Kahn and Robert Heilbronner, I discussed the expansion of historical consciousness into the future, which is part of the process of the extension of history to cover the whole of time. But I don't think that making predictions about the future is the right way to do this. Nevertheless, in several episodes of Today in Philosophy of History, I have expressed my admiration for those who have demonstrated an intuitive insight into coming events. So how do I square this with my dislike for prediction? Part of it is an admiration for those who have an intuitive insight into what's happening and what will happen. So what do I mean by intuitive insight? Roughly speaking, intuition is used in two ways. Firstly, it is used for a kind of perception, whether empirical or intellectual. Kant made a distinction between sensible and non-sensible intuition. Both kinds of intuition simply appear to us, though the mechanism of their being present to consciousness is distinct in each case. And of course, there's no philosophical consensus on this. When philosophers of mathematics talk about intuition, this is the kind of intuition that they mean. Gödel, for example, said that we can perceive abstract objects. Quote, I don't see any reason why we should have less confidence in this kind of perception, i.e. in mathematical intuition, than in sense perception, unquote. When we do perceive abstract objects, if we do perceive them, we perceive them through this kind of non-sensible or intellectual intuition. Secondly, intuition is used to mean the ability to perceive or understand something that is hidden or obscured or not otherwise evident to everyone. In this second sense, intuition is the ability on the part of some people to add up subtle clues, which involve a judgment as to which clues are significant and which clues are trivial and may safely be overlooked. It is also, therefore, the ability to fill in the gaps between the clues to see what was there to be seen, but which was not obvious to everyone. This is the intuition of a Sherlock Holmes or a Miss Marple. The historical intuitive insight that Engels had was of this second kind. Both kinds of intuition are, nevertheless, subject to failure. Kant wrote about what he called transcendental illusory appearance, which is the failure of the first kind of intuition. Often we put together the wrong conclusion from a number of fragmentary clues, and this is the failure of the second kind of intuition. Engels was partly right and partly wrong in his prediction. He put together a partly right, partly wrong prediction from fragmentary clues. His prediction then was a partial success and a partial failure. I said earlier that the connections between the events and predictions were as important as the events and predictions themselves for Engels. And there is a good quote on this from the French historian Fustel de Coulanges, who wrote, quote, supposing 100 specialists had divided the past of France according to law, do you think that in the end they would have written the history of France? I very much doubt it. At the very least, they should miss the linkage of facts. Now, this linkage is itself a historical truth, unquote. I maintain that this is, in effect, the principle from which Engels is working, that the linkage of the facts is itself a historical truth. But this wasn't the only principle from which Engels was working. Many predictions that put together a lot of subtle clues into one big picture do so according to a theory. A theory of nature affords us intuitive insight into how the world works. A theory of human nature affords us intuitive insight into how human beings work and allow us to reconstruct human behaviors even in the absence of records. A theory of history affords us intuitive insight into how history unfolds, and it allows us to reconstruct history even in the absence of evidence. If the theory in question is all wrong, it's going to lead us astray. So the longer we follow it, the further out in the weeds we're going to find ourselves. If the theory in question is right, on the other hand, then it will demonstrate its accuracy with a high degree of predictive and explanatory power. If the theory in question is partly right and partly wrong, it will yield mixed results both in reconstructing the past and in pre-constructing the future. And this predictive and explanatory power will be a hit or miss affair. We know that the basis, or among the bases for Engels' predictions, was the Marxian theory of history. So the mixed success of his predictions is at least partly due to his interpretation of historical materialism. For Engels, Marx's theory of history provided the linkage of facts of the kind that Fustel de Coulanges has called a historical truth in addition to the isolated facts in themselves. Of course, convinced Marxists will insist that Marx's theory of history is just fine, so if it yields mixed results, it does so only because of its faulty interpretation. If Engels got it wrong, or merely partly wrong, it was because the theory of history he was using wasn't real historical materialism. Obviously, this is a rather unprofitable path to pursue. I said earlier that part of what inspires my admiration for those who get a glimpse of the future is their intuitive insight into history yet to come. Another part of my interest is, you could say, negative. Sometimes what's going on is obvious, and not seeing is a function of willful blindness. During especially dishonest periods of history, willful blindness can be the rule, and the ability to see what's actually going on is the exception. When willful blindness is the rule, the few who are not captive to the dominant narrative are the few who will see what's really happening. This is the flip side of using a theory of history to predict the future. It's the ability to stop seeing a theory that makes it possible to see what's really going on. Being too captive to a theory often means interpreting everything so that it is made to fit the theory. This is precisely what historians criticize most harshly in philosophers whom they believe to project a theory onto the past, forcing the facts of history to fit the theory instead of getting the facts right and finding a theory to explain them. So far then, part of what interests me is intuitive insight into the historical process, and another part of what interests me is not having your head turned by a sexy theory. We could also say that we want to see the patterns that are there and which are missed by others, and we want to unsee the patterns that aren't there, which delude and distract others, and sometimes delude and distract us. So there's a dual role of theory. One more part of what's going on can be understood with reference to the distinction that Fernand Braudel, the famous Annales historian, like Marc Bloch and another member of the school, as it were, made between what he called the history of the event, the conjuncture, and the longue durée, which are distinct scales of historical time. For Braudel, the history of the event is the kind of fleeting occurrence that flashes like a spark and then disappears. Car crashes, bank robberies, broken water mains, and hurricanes are all instances of the history of the event. The conjuncture is a period of time of about 15 to 30 years during which some thematically unified historical process unfolds. Boston's Big Dig highway project could be understood as a local conjuncture. The 30 Years' War constituted a regional conjuncture across Europe, and the Cold War space race was, in effect, a planetary scale conjuncture. The longue durée is a period of hundreds of years over which societies and civilizations slowly evolve. The early modern period from 1500 to 1800 is a longue durée period, and it is nested within the longer longue durée of modernity, which includes the presence in ourselves as well. I think that it's possible, even if it's difficult, to grasp the longue durée and to see events and conjunctures as manifestations of the longue durée, which is the deepest strata of history, as it were. You could call this prediction when we understand what's going on with the longue durée and then we apply it to history. I would prefer to call it extrapolation. And we could illustrate this by making a distinction between what I will call substantive prediction and formal prediction. Substantive prediction is the conventional or familiar idea of prediction. If I were to make the prediction that the rise of China as a naval power, and China now has 2 active aircraft carriers and another expected to begin a sea trial soon. If I were to predict that China's Navy will inevitably come into conflict in the Pacific with US naval assets, that would be a substantive prediction. It would be a much better prediction if I specified more about how these navies would come into conflict, and if I were to give a clear date by which the conflict would become a hot war. Formal prediction is an extrapolation of a structure existing in the present that will continue to exist in the future and will continue to manifest itself, albeit under changed conditions. If I were to make the prediction that a rising power and a declining power that share an operational frontier often come into conflict, that would be a formal prediction. It also bears some resemblance to Carl Hempel's covering law model of historical explanation. Obviously, the two examples I've given, there is a gray area that separates substantive and formal prediction, but there still is a separation between the two that we can observe. A formal prediction is like the oracle at Delphi, telling the representatives of King Croesus, if King Croesus crosses the Halys River, a great empire will be destroyed. Croesus, believing that this was a prediction that the Persian Empire would be destroyed, crossed the Halys River, engaged the Persian at the Battle of Pteria, and in doing so set in motion a series of events that would destroy a great empire, which was his own empire. My prediction about conflict between rising and declining naval powers is ambiguous in much the same way as the Delphic oracle was ambiguous. The ambiguity stems from leaving crucial terms undefined. You get a formal prediction if you substitute variables for values in a substantive prediction, and you get a substantive prediction if you substitute values for variables in a formal prediction. It's like the difference between arithmetic and algebra, and both of them have their uses. This ambiguity is frustrating from a substantive perspective, but the aim isn't to substitute values for the variables, but to construct a better formal model that is a more accurate reflection of the historical process that our previous model attempted to capture. It's also an iterative process that can be improved in the same way that super forecasters improve their substantive forecasts. I haven't fully thought this through yet, so it's still pretty speculative, and the distinction needs a lot more work to be satisfying. So that's all I'm going to say about it for the time being. I could have saved all of this for Engels' birthday on the 28th of November, but by that time, the connection to my Ernst Jünger episode would have been lost. So thanks for the individual who commented and brought my attention to the quote from Engels, and thanks for listening.